Hello, I'm Norbert Gleicher and Dr, Medical Director and Chief Scientist here at the Center for Human Reproduction, with my two colleagues, David Barad, David Albertini, both long collaborators and long active both in clinical work as well as basic research. David Albertini, on top of it, is the editor-in-chief of the Journal for Assisted Reproduction and Genetics, which is becoming an increasingly important medical journal in our field. We want today to address a rather controversial issue, and that is the aging ovary. And I think there are lots of questions regarding the aging ovary. And I would like to start with probably the most basic question. What does it mean that ovaries age? Beyond the fact that it is obviously the first organ in the human body to age, more so than any other organ. But what does it mean that the ovary is aging? Want to take this, David?
I'd be happy to take that on from a very basic perspective, which is, what does the ovary do for us? Okay, the ovary has two fundamental functions, okay, from a physiological point of view. It's necessary for synthesizing on schedule the steroid hormones and peptide hormones that regulate the menstrual cycle and are at the heart of our basic reproductive physiology. But besides being an endocrine organ, it also releases a cell. Once a month, a mature oocyte is ovulated. And that is essentially the rate-limiting step in whether or not, in our species and so many other mammalian species, the species will continue. So what is it then that sets apart the normal ovary, during its peak functional times from that in an aged individual? Okay, and what we've come to sense is that it's not so much that the ovary runs out of gas, because it does continue to undergo cycles, but these cycles change. They change from an endocrine point of view. The whole system of feedback with the hypothalamus and the reproductive axis may be altered, but from the oocyte's point of view, which is something that my lab has studied over the years, we see that the oocytes that come out of the aging ovary are more prone to, for example, errors in the final steps of meiosis. Okay,
therefore, chromosomal abnormalities.
The chromosomal abnormalities that we're all familiar with when we talk about why is Down syndrome or trisomy 21 more prevalent in older women. Okay, and we know that this at some sort of basic cellular level must have involved a change in the way those oocytes or eggs were developing in that ovary. And there are lots of really, I think, important discoveries that have been made in the last 10 years that begin to pinpoint in animal models and in humans what it is that makes this chromosomal vulnerability present itself. I think, both of you are in a better position to speak to the endocrine changes that are going on, as the ovary ages. And of course, at the end of the day, then these must be integrated processes.
Yeah, and those endocrine changes obviously end in menopause, and you, David, have done a lot of work in your younger years on menopause. It's a really unique phenomenon in human biology, because it's an organ that basically ends its function at a relatively young age nowadays. In the old days, when a woman's life expectancy was in the 40s, it was not a young event, but now it is a young event.
Yeah, so, the effect of loss of ovarian function in menopause is manifold. So people get all the symptoms of hot flashes, difficulty sleeping, vaginal dryness, loss of sexual function, loss of libido, because not only do they lose estrogen as they get older, they lose some androgens as well. And so there are a lot of issues, we studied that back in the Women's Health Initiative. We found that hormone replacement actually is the best way to protect against hip fractures, against fractures and osteoporosis. It actually seems to be somewhat protective against GI cancer. But unfortunately, it has some negative effects on breast cancer. That increases risk of actually transition to breast cancer, and in some cases, can in the initial years you take hormones can increase risk of stroke and heart disease. Although ultimately, there seem to be people who get through those first few years seem to have some sort of protective effect in terms of heart disease. But beyond that, at this point, we're more interested in the reproductive function.
Yeah, and I wanted to get back to that because it is the core of the reproductive function is the fact that women are born with principally all of their eggs, and that they from birth constantly lose eggs. Indeed, they start losing them while they are still in utero in their mothers. That's actually the biggest loss of that
I
time
tell my
period.
patients that by the time they reach puberty, they've lost 95% of their
That
original
is right.
cohort of eggs. Yeah.
And after puberty, actually the loss slows down significantly. And even after menopause, which is usually on average at age 51, 52, women still have eggs, small numbers, but still have eggs in their ovaries, but those eggs no longer respond to the cues from hormones.
And what I tell patients is it takes a village, so that when there are a lot of eggs in the ovaries, there's not one follicle making the journey to ovulate. It's a whole cohort of follicles that are working together to ultimately support one to the top of the pyramid that ovulates. And as you get older and the cohort of follicles get smaller and smaller, you don't have that additional support. You have these isolated follicles all over the place, and they're not supporting each other anymore. So,
Yeah, and age does its own, even though recently there's increasing evidence that as long as eggs remain in their primitive stages, as so-called primordial follicles in the capsules of the ovary, and as long as they're not recruited out of that stage, they are pretty safe.
Very quiescent.
Yeah, and not much happens to them because their metabolism is so low. So in other words, that's not where this aging really primarily occurs. Where the age comes into play is once those eggs are recruited and start the journey into maturation. And what seems to be the problem is not so much the age of those eggs, but the age of the environment in which those eggs now are expected to mature, meaning the ovarian tissue. Right?
It is right. I think it's so key to share with our viewers that the eggs are stored in those primordial follicles, and they are normally in a very protected environment. The cortex of the ovary is really a connective tissue layer that lacks vasculature, it lacks innervation, etc. And as we've discussed many times, it does seem like the repeated cycles with drawing upon these cohorts. I really like the metaphor of it takes a village, because there is something special in the younger cycling ovary about this being a team effort to build one dominant follicle, okay? And as the ovary ages, it consumes so much of this somatic tissue support. I'll give one quick example. The vascularity of the follicle, which is key for regulating all of the hormonal interactions as a follicle develops, diminishes over time. There's less and less angiogenesis going on in the ovary of an older person versus a younger one. And as we've come to realize, this, when you say the ovary is now being viewed as one of the first organs to age, okay, this is one reason why. It kind of runs out of a youthful source of the stem cells that will be making the blood vessels that will be supporting this. You know, so it's secondary. I always say there are the oocentrists, the people who think about ovarian aging only from the point of view of the oocyte. But then I think there are those of us that have a little broader scope in this problem. As you're saying, this is really the change in the ovarian environment. And indirectly, the oocyte is probably being the victim of this change in the somatic cell environment.
Yeah. And this brings us then to the next question, and we don't have much time left for that, but what can we do to improve egg quality? And from what we just discussed also follows that improvement obviously must happen during that journey of maturation. It cannot happen after we retrieve the eggs in an IVF cycle in our operating.
To be clear for our audience, this journey takes months. 2, 3, 4 months.
3 or 4 months,
And it's not just the 2 weeks from your period to the time you ovulate. That's the end of the game.
Yeah.
We're talking about the whole preliminary journey while these follicles are developing in the ovarian environment. So our approach has been to try to do what we can do to improve the environment in various
during
ways.
that time period. And I think that obviously is the only approach that makes any sense, and the question arises, how successful can we be? But this is the rationale behind, for example, treating with androgen supplementation, with DHEA, or treating with human growth hormone supplementation. The purpose of those supplementation weeks before you start an IVF cycle is to support that journey of those follicles, rather than once it's too late and you have those eggs in your hands, then there's nothing left to be done at this point.
Yeah, I'm not sure how much time we have, but I will share with our viewers that when I joined these two friends of mine, they were the ones who first began to give me a sense for what the somatic cell deficiencies were in the aging ovary. And finally, I came to realize this was at the heart of your androgen supplementation, which to me made a lot of sense, knowing that there were thecal deficiencies at the core of this. So that is, but one of the steps that I think you've taken.
Adrenal insufficiencies, because it is the adrenal portion of androgen production in those women that usually gives up.
Right. Yeah. But it was, the challenge that the two of you took on to try and understand this difference in an aging woman that really led you to this type of therapy, which again, for our audience, this has to be done well in advance.
Of course.
Because these oocytes, these eggs, take a long time to get ready for becoming
The correlate is
competent.
that it won't work in everybody. You can't take a 70-year-old person and expect it to have some effect. There have to be some follicles left,
Of course.
to support in this way. So,
Yeah.
I mean, the best effect is in somebody sort of 38 to 44, and beyond that, we get some effect.
Yeah, I mean, we have gotten eggs from women in the early 50s. We have made embryos, but they have not had the quality to yet give us a live birth. Yeah.
But when we began IVF, we wouldn't take care of anybody over the age of 40.
38 in the early days
yeah.
of IVF. 38.